The morning Cyrus Yates drove the last fence post into the red earth of his southwestern Colorado property, he stood back, wiped the sweat from his brow with the back of his forearm, and realized with a hollow certainty that he had no idea why he had built any of it. 7 years. 7 years of hauling timber and shaping stone, of negotiating water rights with the county land office in Durango, of sleepless nights listening to the wind howl through half-finished walls while coyotes serenaded the darkness outside. 7 years of blistered hands and aching backs and mornings, where the cold was so sharp it felt like the world itself was trying to warn him away. The ranch sat on 400 acres of rolling high desert grassland, tucked at the foot of the San Juan Mountains, and it was without question the finest piece of private property in Mesa Verde County. Everyone said so. His neighbors said so. The land agent who had sold him the original parcel in 1879 had ridden out just the previous autumn, taken one long look at the white-fenced pastures and the painted barn and the solid two-story house with its wide front porch, and told Cyrus with a kind of reverent disbelief that he had never seen a man build so much alone. Cyrus had smiled and thanked him and gone back to his work, because work was the only language he trusted. He was 31 years old in the spring of 1886, lean and weathered in the particular way that the Colorado high country makes men lean and weathered, with dark brown hair that curled slightly at the ends when it grew too long and gray eyes that people occasionally described as serious when they were being polite. He was not an unfriendly man, but he was quiet in the way that the land around him was quiet, full of depth and pressure beneath a surface that gave very little away. He had come to Colorado from Missouri in 1879 with a small inheritance from his father, a dead man's warhorse that turned out to be smarter than most people Cyrus had ever met, and a conviction that if he built something real and lasting with his own hands, the emptiness that lived in the center of his chest might eventually fill up with something worth having. It had not filled. The ranch was beautiful and solid and running well, with a small herd of cattle, 12 good horses, a working windmill that pulled clean water from the aquifer below, and a bunkhouse where 2 hired hands named Pete Aldridge and a quiet older man everyone called Dutch slept and played cards at night. The vegetables in the kitchen garden were already pushing up through the dark soil. The apple trees he had planted in the first year were old enough now to produce real fruit. There was a smokehouse and a root cellar and a chicken coop and a spring house and a forge where Cyrus could shoe his own horses when needed. And it was all, every single magnificent acre and timber and stone of it, completely empty. He had not allowed himself to think about that emptiness directly in a long time. There was always another task, always another problem to solve, always another section of fence or another sick animal or another arrangement to make with the cattle buyers who came through from Denver each autumn. But the morning after he drove that last fence post into the earth, he sat on the front porch in the gray pre-dawn with a cup of coffee that had gone cold in his hand, and he looked out at everything he had made, and the silence of it pressed against him like something physical. He was still sitting there when Pete Aldridge came around the corner of the barn, already dressed and heading to feed the horses, and stopped when he saw his employer sitting motionless in the dark. "You sleep at all last night, Cyrus?" Pete called across the yard. "Some," Cyrus said, which was not entirely a lie. He had slept for perhaps 2 hours before some unnamed anxiety had pulled him back to consciousness. Pete was 25, a good-natured young man from Kansas with reddish hair and a perpetual good humor that Cyrus had come to depend on more than he ever admitted. He walked over and leaned against the porch railing, looking at his employer with the comfortable directness of a man who has worked closely beside another man long enough to say what he thinks. "You know what this place needs," Pete said. "Don't," Cyrus said. "A woman," Pete said anyway, grinning. "A real one. Not the idea of one. Go feed the horses, Pete." Pete went, still grinning. Cyrus stared at his cold coffee and pretended the words had not landed anywhere meaningful. They had, of course. They always did whenever the subject came up, which was not often because Cyrus had a talent for making it clear that certain topics were not for discussion. But the truth was that Pete was not wrong, and Cyrus knew it. He had built something a family would live in. He had built something for a life he had not yet begun to live. He just did not know how to begin. He was still thinking about it. In the distracted way he thought about things that felt too large and shapeless to approach directly, when he rode into the town of Harlow 3 days later for supplies. Harlow was not much of a town. It had grown up along a spur of the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad that had pushed west in the late 1870s, and it was the kind of place that existed because geography demanded some place exist there, not because anyone had particularly wanted it to. There was a general store run by a German family named Bauer, a livery stable, a post office that shared space with a small barbershop, a saloon called the Copper Penny that was loud on Saturday nights and deserted the rest of the week, a small church that the Methodist congregation used on Sundays, and a handful of homes where the permanent residents lived with the resigned pragmatism of people who had stopped somewhere they meant to be temporary and then stayed. Cyrus tied his horse outside the general store and went in to collect his order. And it was while he was waiting for Henrik Bauer to locate the sack of flour he had requested that he heard something from the back of the store that made him stop and actually pay attention to the world around him for the first time in several days. A woman's voice, low and clear, saying with absolute calm to someone out of his sight, "I was told the rate was $2.30 a night, and I have paid for 3 nights in advance, and I would very much appreciate it if you would honor the agreement your wife made when I wrote to her last month." The voice answering her was male and sullen and belonged, Cyrus guessed from the sound of it, to Arthur Mott, who owned the only lodging house in Harlow and had a well-established reputation for treating guests with a kind of casual disdain that the town tolerated because no one had any alternative. "My wife makes no agreements on my behalf," Arthur Mott said. "Rate went up." "Then I would like to speak with your wife," the woman said. "She's not available." "Then I would like my $6.90 returned to me, and I will find other arrangements." There was a pause. Cyrus had moved toward the back of the store without quite deciding to, his boots quiet on the plank floor. He came around a shelf stacked with canned goods and saw them standing near the rear door. Arthur Mott red-faced and carrying the particular look of a man who has backed himself into a corner and blames the person who found him there, and the woman. He saw her, and the world did something unusual, which was that it got very quiet and very specific all at once, the way it sometimes does when a man suddenly understands that the moment he is standing in is different from all the other moments that came before it. She was perhaps 26 or 27, with dark auburn hair coiled at the back of her neck under a traveling hat that had clearly seen a long journey, and she had the kind of face that was not immediately remarkable and then became, the longer you looked at it, the most interesting face you could imagine looking at. High cheekbones and dark brown eyes that were fixed on Arthur Mott with a direct and completely unfrightened regard that Cyrus found arresting. She was wearing a gray wool traveling dress, practical and worn, and she had a small carpet bag in one hand and a leather document case tucked under her arm, and she was standing with the posture of a woman who is very tired and very determined not to let it show. Arthur Mott said something else that Cyrus did not catch, and the woman said, "That is not acceptable," very quietly, and it was the quiet that did it. "Mott," Cyrus said, coming fully around the shelf. Both of them looked at him. "Is there a problem here?" Arthur Mott's expression shifted from sullen to defensive, which was a move Cyrus had seen before and knew how to handle. "Not your concern, Yates. Private business." "The lady seems distressed," Cyrus said, which was not quite true because distressed was not the word for how she looked. Resolved was closer, controlled, but something was owed to the social convention of the thing. The woman turned and looked at him, and he felt her assessment as a physical thing, quick and precise. "I am not distressed," she said. "I am being cheated, which is a different condition entirely." Cyrus had not expected that, and he felt something shift in his expression that he had not shifted in a long time, which was the particular internal movement of a man who is surprised into genuine amusement. He looked back at Mott. "The lady has a contract with your wife, Arthur. Honor it or give her back her money." Arthur Mott looked from Cyrus to the woman and back to Cyrus. Cyrus was not particularly large, but he was solid, and he had the kind of stillness that men who have worked alone in hard country sometimes develop, a stillness that communicated more than words about the likelihood of persuasion in either direction. Mott calculated the situation for a moment, then reached into his coat pocket and produced $6.90, which he held out to the woman with the expression of a man swallowing something unpleasant. She took the money with a dignity that was almost painful to witness, counted it, put it in her coat pocket, and turned to Cyrus. "Thank you," she said, "though I could have managed." "I expect you could have," Cyrus said. "Where are you heading?" She looked at him for a moment, and something moved across her face that might have been surprise, or might have been the particular calculation of a woman who has learned to evaluate strangers very quickly. "I was heading to the lodging house," she said. "As you have perhaps gathered, that is now changed. I'm looking for a place called the Yates Ranch. I was told in Durango it was somewhere outside this town." She paused. "Do you know it?" He stared at her. "I know it reasonably well," he said. "I built it." She looked at him for another moment, and then something in her expression shifted, a very small shift but a real one, something that might have been relief, or might have been the beginning of something else that she was not yet ready to name. "My name is Eva Hawkins," she said, extending her hand, which was not typical but which felt entirely appropriate given everything else about her. "I wrote to the county land office in Durango 2 months ago inquiring about domestic work in the area. They wrote back and suggested your property." Cyrus shook her hand. Her grip was firm and she held it for exactly the right amount of time. "Cyrus Yates," he said, though she already knew. "What kind of domestic work are you looking for?" "Anything honest," she said. "Cooking, housekeeping, management of a household. I have experience with all of it. I can also keep accounts if needed." He thought about the cold coffee on his porch that morning. He thought about Pete Aldridge's grinning face saying the word woman. He thought about the kitchen in the ranch house that had never been used to its capacity because he ate simply and Pete and Dutch mostly cooked in the bunkhouse. "You'd better come with me then," he said. "If you're willing, the ranch is 6 miles out." She looked at him, at his face and his hands and something in the set of his shoulders, with that same rapid and unsentimental assessment. Then she nodded. "I'm willing," she said. He borrowed a horse from the livery for her, a steady bay mare that Eva Hawkins mounted with the easy competence of someone who had ridden before and did not need to announce it. They rode the 6 miles largely in silence, because silence was comfortable to Cyrus, and because Eva seemed to be the kind of person who did not fill quiet with unnecessary words, which he found immediately and deeply comfortable. The high desert around them was beginning to green with the early spring, the scrub oak budding out and the meadow grasses pushing up through last year's brown tangle, and the San Juan Mountains still held their snow above them in great clean-edged sweeps of white against the blue sky. He watched her take it in. She did not comment on the landscape, but he could see her receiving it, the way her eyes moved across the mountain faces, and the wide sky with a kind of hunger that she was not fully hiding. He thought she might have been somewhere enclosed for a long time. When the ranch came into view around the last curve of the track, with the white house sitting solid and clean on the rise above the creek bend and the big red barn behind it and the green-painted fences catching the afternoon light, she stopped her horse. She just stopped and looked at it for a long moment. "You built all of this yourself," she said. "Mostly," he said. 7 years." She was quiet for another moment. Then she said, almost to herself, almost not intending him to hear it, "Someone put a great deal of love into this place." He had not thought about it that way. He had thought about it in terms of board feet and fence post spacing and the load capacity of the water storage tank. But the word love sat in the air between them, and he found he had no useful response to it, so he said nothing and they rode on down to the yard. Pete Aldridge was splitting wood near the barn when they rode in, and he stopped with his axe raised and stared at Eva with an expression that was entirely too openly delighted for Cyrus's comfort. "Pete," Cyrus said, dismounting, "this is Eva Hawkins. She'll be taking the spare room in the house and managing the household. Treat her accordingly." Pete set down his axe with a thump, pulled off his hat and said, "Ma'am, it is a genuine pleasure," with the enthusiasm of a man who has been secretly praying for exactly this development for some time. Eva looked at him with those steady dark eyes and said, "Thank you, Pete," with a warmth that was real without being excessive, and Pete looked at Cyrus with an expression that clearly communicated his opinion that everything was going to be fine, all of it forever. Dutch was less dramatic about the introduction, being Dutch, which meant he came out of the bunkhouse, looked at Eva for a moment with the kind of deep assessment that very old men sometimes have access to, and nodded once in a way that somehow communicated complete approval, then went back inside. Cyrus showed Eva the house. He had not thought much about the house from the inside in some time. He lived in it the way a working man lives in a good tool, practically and without sentiment. But walking through it behind Eva, watching her take in the wide kitchen with its iron range and good work surfaces, the solid dining room with its long table he had built himself from salvaged timber, the parlor where no one ever sat because there was no one to sit in it, the back bedroom where he slept and the front bedroom that had never been used by anyone. He saw it through her eyes and felt, for the first time, the particular loneliness of it all. She touched the kitchen worktop with one hand and said, "This is a good kitchen." "I try to make it practical," he said. She opened the back door and looked out at the kitchen garden where the early spring planting was already up. She looked at the root cellar door and the smokehouse and the chicken coop with the careful attention of someone making assessments. "You have done a remarkable amount of work here," she said, turning back to him. "Remarkably thoughtful work. Most working ranches I have seen are built for function and nothing else. This has been built as though someone intended it to be lived in completely." He did not know what to say to that, so he said, "I hope the room suits you. There's a decent mattress and I can have Pete bring up the spare dresser from the bunkhouse storage if you need it." She said the room suited her very well. She said she would start on dinner if he would show her where things were kept. She said it all with a matter-of-fact competence that he found extraordinarily restful, like stepping into shade on a very hot day. That evening, she made a supper of roasted chicken from one of the birds Cyrus had not gotten around to using, with onions and sage, and a pan of cornbread that came out of the oven golden and smelling like something out of a distant memory. And she set it on the big dining table, and told Pete and Dutch they were welcome to eat with the household if they wanted to, because she had made enough for 6 and there were only 4 of them. Pete said yes before she finished the sentence. Dutch came in without a word and sat down and ate 3 servings and said it was good, which from Dutch was the equivalent of a standing ovation. Cyrus sat at the head of the table and ate and listened to Pete talk and watched Eva manage the conversation with the ease of a woman who has spent time learning to make people comfortable, and something that had been tight in his chest for a very long time began to loosen, just slightly, just enough to notice. After Pete and Dutch had gone back to the bunkhouse, and Eva had cleared the dishes with the quiet efficiency that was already beginning to feel characteristic of her, Cyrus found himself lingering at the table with no particular reason to be there, which was not something that happened to him often. "How long were you looking for a position?" he asked, not sure why he was asking. She dried her hands on the kitchen cloth and turned to look at him with those dark eyes. "About 4 months," she said. "I came from St. Louis originally. I was working for a family there as a housekeeper, but they moved east and I didn't want to follow them." "What made you want to come west?" She was quiet for a moment in the way that people are quiet when they are deciding how much truth to tell. "I wanted something real," she said finally. St. Louis is becoming a city in all the ways that cities become cities, which is not always good. Everything there felt like it was being papered over. I wanted to be somewhere the paper hadn't reached yet. He understood that. He understood it with a precision that surprised him. "This is a good place for that," he said. She looked at him with a small, genuine smile that was different from the polite professional expression she had been wearing all afternoon. It was brief, just a flash, but it was real, and it did something to the already unsettled quality of his interior landscape. "I think it might be," she said. The weeks that followed had a quality that Cyrus would later think of as the best and most disorienting period of his adult life, because everything was the same and everything was completely different. Eva moved through the ranch house, and by extension through the ranch itself, with a quiet, capable presence that reorganized everything not by force, but by attention. She identified the systems that were working and left them alone. She identified the systems that were not working and fixed them with a practicality that occasionally made Pete Aldridge stare at her with open reverence. She discovered that the root cellar was damp and found the source of moisture in a crack in the north wall, which she filled herself with lime mortar before Cyrus even knew there was a problem. She organized the kitchen stores so that for the first time in 7 years Cyrus always knew what they had and what they needed before it became urgent. She started a kitchen garden expansion that doubled the planted area and set up a proper composting system in the corner of the yard. She was extraordinary at the practical work, efficient and knowledgeable and creative within the constraints of what was available. But what Cyrus noticed, in the private interior of his observation, was that she was also extraordinary at existing in the world in a way that made the world around her feel more alive. She sang sometimes when she was working in the kitchen. Not performing, not even consciously most of the time, just low, half-voiced songs that drifted through the house and out into the yard, old hymns and folk songs, and once, memorably, something in what might have been French that Pete claimed made his coffee taste better. She had an opinion about everything, but offered those opinions only when asked or when the situation genuinely required them, which Cyrus found both refreshing and occasionally maddening, because he found himself creating situations in which he could reasonably ask for her opinion on things. He found himself doing other things too. He found himself staying at the dinner table longer than necessary. He found himself riding back from the south pasture by the longer route that brought him past the kitchen garden, where she was usually working in the late afternoon. He found himself paying attention to the weather in a new way, worrying about whether it would be too cold for the seedlings she had just transplanted. He found himself, one evening, sitting on the front porch after supper and talking with her for 2 hours about nothing in particular, about the San Juan Mountains and the way the light changed on them through the seasons, about the history of the land and what it had been before ranching came, about books, about her time in St. Louis and his time in Missouri before that. And when Pete stuck his head out of the bunkhouse to ask if everything was all right, Cyrus realized with a start that it was nearly 10 o'clock and completely dark. She had a history she shared in pieces, the way the mountain reveals itself in sections as you ride closer. She was from Ohio originally, had come to St. Louis with her late husband, a good man named Eva Hawkins who had died of fever 3 years ago, leaving her a widow at 24 with no children and no property, and a very clear understanding that she was going to have to build her own life entirely from what she could make with her own hands and her own mind. She spoke of Daniel with a kind of honest grief, not the performed grief of someone seeking sympathy, but the straightforward acknowledgement of a woman who had loved a man and lost him, and carried that loss without letting it become the whole of her story. Cyrus thought about that in the privacy of his own head for several days. He thought about the quality of a person who could hold grief without being consumed by it. He thought about the particular courage it must have taken for a woman alone in 1883 to begin rebuilding everything from nothing, in a world that was not constructed to make that easy. He thought about Eva Hawkins with a frequency that was beginning to be difficult to pretend was professional concern. The complication came in late May, about 6 weeks after her arrival, in the form of a man named Garrett Cole. Garrett Cole was the owner of the Dry Mesa Cattle Company, which occupied the land to the south and east of Cyrus's property, and he was the kind of man who had come west early enough to accumulate significant acreage, and had mistaken that accumulation for a kind of authority that no one had actually granted him. He was perhaps 45, wide through the shoulders and narrow through the eyes, with the self-satisfied expression of a man who is accustomed to getting what he wants through a combination of money and implied consequence. He rode up to the Yates ranch on a Wednesday morning with 2 of his riders at his heels, which was the first indication that something was about to be unpleasant, because a man paying a social call does not typically bring company. Cyrus was in the yard talking to Dutch about the condition of the east fence when Cole rode in, and he turned and waited with the still, watchful patience that was his natural mode in difficult situations. "Yates," Cole said, not dismounting, which was a deliberate choice, "I hear you've got a woman up here now." "I have a housekeeper," Cyrus said. "Good morning, Garrett." Cole looked around the yard with the proprietary regard of a man inventorying something he considers his. "I came to extend an invitation. There's a social gathering at my place on Saturday. My wife is putting it on. I expect you'll want to bring your housekeeper," Cyrus said. "I'll pass it along." Cole nodded, and then he let a pause go on a beat too long in the way that men like him use silence as a pressure instrument. "Word of advice, Yates. A young woman on her own out here. People talk. You want to make sure the arrangement is above board." "It is above board," Cyrus said, and his voice was very even. "Of course," Cole said, with a smile that did not reach his eyes. "Just looking out for the reputation of everyone involved." He glanced toward the house, and Cyrus watched him look at the front porch where Eva had appeared at some point in the last few minutes, standing quietly with her arms folded, watching. Cole's expression shifted into something that Cyrus did not like the look of. "A fine-looking woman," Cole said. "Shame about the circumstances." "Saturday social," Cyrus said. "Thank you for the invitation. Good day, Garrett." Cole held his gaze for a moment longer than was comfortable, then wheeled his horse and rode back out of the yard with his men, and the dust he kicked up settled slowly over the white fence rails. Cyrus stood where he was until they were out of sight, then turned and looked at the porch. Eva had come down the steps and was standing in the yard, and she was looking after Cole with an expression that he recognized because he had worn it himself on occasion, the expression of a person who has accurately assessed a danger and is deciding how to respond to it. "That man is going to be trouble," she said. "Likely," Cyrus agreed. She turned and looked at him directly. "What kind of trouble?" He was quiet for a moment, because he was deciding how to say it honestly. "Cole has been after the water rights on the creek that runs through the east end of my property for 3 years. He's tried to buy them twice, and I've said no both times. A man like him doesn't stop wanting what he's been told he can't have." She looked at the east tree line where the creek ran, invisible from the yard, but its presence indicated by the line of cottonwoods along its banks. "The creek feeds his lower pastures if he had access." "Yes. And what will he do when buying doesn't work?" He looked at her. Most people asked whether Cole would try something, not what he would try. "I don't know yet," he said honestly, "but I'd like to be ready for whatever it is." She nodded once with the decisiveness that he had come to associate with her when a problem had been properly acknowledged and a course of action was being set. "Then we should know exactly what we have in the way of documented rights," she said. "Do you have your land papers and the water rights agreement in order?" He did, but she found 2 gaps in the documentation when she sat down with it that afternoon, places where the county record and the copy he held did not perfectly match in language, and she wrote a careful letter to the land office in Durango noting the discrepancies and requesting clarification, which Dutch rode into town to post the following morning. Cyrus watched all of this and felt something he was not quite ready to name. The Saturday social at the Cole Ranch was held in the large yard of the Cole main house, which was expansive in the way that buildings constructed primarily to impress tend to be expansive, all front and not much depth. There were perhaps 40 people there from the scattered ranches and homesteads of the surrounding area, the kind of gathering that served as much social function as political one in an area where neighbors might otherwise go months without seeing each other. Cyrus went because refusing the invitation would have communicated a weakness he was not willing to show Cole. Eva went because she said she would find it useful to know the landscape of the community she was living in. Pete went because there would be food. Eva wore a dark blue dress that Cyrus had not seen before and had clearly been kept for a specific occasion. It was simple and well-fitted, and she wore it with the unconscious elegance of a woman who does not need to try. She had pinned her hair up differently than usual, and several strands had escaped in the May wind to curl against the back of her neck, and Cyrus noticed this and then spent some time trying to stop noticing it. Garrett Cole's wife, Margaret, was a small, sharp-eyed woman who managed the social proceedings with the precision of a general commanding a campaign, and she received Eva with the particular complex reception that women of established position in small communities offer to attractive newcomers, which combined genuine courtesy with a careful inventory. The evening would have gone smoothly enough, but Garrett Cole had a way of inserting himself into situations that revealed his actual intentions. He found Eva near the refreshment table about an hour into the gathering, when Cyrus had moved away to speak with a neighboring rancher named Folsom about a fence line they shared, and Cyrus saw from across the yard the particular geometry of it, Cole standing too close, his hand on Eva's arm, Eva's body angled back just slightly. He crossed the yard without hurrying, because hurrying would escalate it, but he moved with the directness of a man who has made a decision. He arrived close enough to hear Cole saying, "A woman of your capabilities deserves better than a hired position, Mrs. Hawkins. If you were ever looking for a change of circumstance, I am quite satisfied with my current circumstance, Mr. Cole," Eva said, and her voice was perfectly level. "Thank you for the evening, it's been lovely." She turned and found Cyrus there, and something in her expression shifted, a very small release of something that had been held tight. "Folsom wants to know if we can ride the south fence line next week," Cyrus said, as though he had come over for that reason, which let everyone keep their dignity. He offered his arm to Eva because it was the natural thing to do in the moment, and she took it without hesitation, and they walked away across the lantern-lit yard together with the composed ease of two people who have been doing this for years. She did not release his arm until they were near the edge of the gathering, and when she did, she said quietly, "Thank you." "Cole is overreaching," he said. "Yes," she agreed. "He is." She was quiet for a moment. "He offered me a position at his ranch." Cyrus felt something cold move through him that was not quite anger and not quite fear, but was in the general territory of both. And I declined," she said, with the tone of a person stating something that should not have required stating. She looked at him with those dark eyes, direct and steady. "I am not interested in anything that man has to offer." "I'm glad to hear it," Cyrus said, and he meant it with more weight than he intended to convey, which she may or may not have heard. He added, because something else in him needed to say it, "The position here is yours as long as you want it. If Cole makes further approaches that make you uncomfortable, I would like to know." She looked at him for a moment. "You're protective," she said, not unkindly. "It's my property and you're in my employ," he said, which was true but not the whole truth, and he suspected they both knew it. She smiled then, that small, real smile that did things to his interior landscape. "It is an excellent ranch," she said. "I intend to stay." June came and the high desert bloomed and the ranch settled into the deep working rhythm of summer. The cattle were in good condition and the spring calves were strong and the hay fields were coming in well, and Cyrus found himself doing something he had not done in 7 years, which was looking forward to coming home. That was the word he noticed himself using, in his interior monologue and occasionally out loud. Home. He had always said the ranch before. Now it was home, and he knew precisely when that had changed, and the knowledge of it sat in him like a coal, warm and central and occasionally alarming. He was aware that what was happening to him had to be approached with care. Eva was in his employ. She was a widow who had come west looking for honest work and a new beginning, not looking for a man who had accidentally built her a house without knowing she existed. He was not a man who mistook proximity for welcome, and he did not intend to start, so he was careful. He was courteous and considerate and professionally appropriate, and he managed this with most of his attention while the rest of him noticed things he was not supposed to be noticing, like the way she laughed when Pete told a joke that was actually funny, a real laugh, full-throated and genuine, or the way she held her coffee cup in both hands in the cold mornings on the back step, looking at the mountains with an expression of pure and unguarded peace. He noticed the evening she came to find him in the barn, where he was sitting with a mare that was having a difficult labor, and she sat down on the hay across from him without a word, and stayed there the whole 4 hours until the foal was safely delivered. And when he looked at her across the mare's exhausted body in the lantern light, she was looking back at him with an expression that he could not fully read, but that made the hair on his arms stand up. He noticed the afternoon she appeared at the door of the forge where he was working with a plate of food because he had missed lunch, and instead of leaving the plate she stayed and watched him work. And when he looked up, she was watching his hands with an expression that made him miss a beat of the hammer and overstrike the metal. He noticed that she had rearranged the furniture in the parlor, which no one had ever used, so that there were 2 chairs facing the front window at an angle that caught the evening light, and that in the evenings she sometimes sat in one of them reading, and that she had left the other one empty in a way that felt like an invitation. He sat in it one evening in early July and did not say anything, and she did not say anything, and they read in the same room in the quiet comfort of it, and it was, Cyrus thought, the best evening he had had in 7 years. He was not the only one paying attention. Dutch, who spoke approximately 40 words a day and reserved them all for things worth saying, appeared at Cyrus's elbow one morning while Cyrus was watching Eva talk to a traveling seed merchant near the gate, and said, without preamble, "You should tell her," and walked away before Cyrus could respond. Pete was less subtle. Pete, who had been Cyrus's most reliable hand and his most reliable source of unsolicited personal advice for 3 years, appeared to be in a state of permanent suppressed excitement, grinning at Cyrus over Eva's head at dinner and making gestures that Cyrus found both transparent and irritating. "You are not as subtle as you believe, Pete," Cyrus told him one morning in the barn. "With respect," Pete said cheerfully, forking hay, "neither are you." Cyrus pointed out that Pete's employment was at his discretion. Pete pointed out with great accuracy that Cyrus was not going to fire him. They regarded each other for a moment and then went back to work. The trouble with Garrett Cole escalated in mid-July in the way that Cyrus had been half expecting, which was through a third party rather than direct confrontation. A man named Werner Hogue, who operated a small cattleman's legal practice out of Durango, appeared at the ranch on a Thursday morning with a letter stating that Garrett Cole was challenging the terms of Cyrus's water rights agreement on the grounds that the creek in question had been established as a shared waterway under the original 1877 territorial survey, which predated Cyrus's individual rights claim and therefore superseded it. Cyrus read the letter twice, and then he went and found Eva because she had sent the letter to Durango in May and she had read all the documentation, and she would know more clearly than he did what the letter meant. She read it once, very carefully, and then she looked up with an expression that was calm but precise. "He is wrong," she said, "but he is cleverly wrong, which is more dangerous." The 1877 survey did designate the creek as a waterway, but the individual rights assignment in 1880 superseded that designation for private parcels under the Homestead Act provisions. Your rights predate his claim to this land. The question is whether the Durango Land Office will confirm that interpretation. Can we prove it? We need the original 1877 survey document alongside the 1880 rights assignment, she said. Do you have the 1880 document? Yes. Then we need the 1877 survey. That will be in the territorial records in Denver. He looked at her. You know land law. She looked back at him steadily. Daniel was a land surveyor, she said. I worked alongside him for 4 years. I learned. A pause. Would you trust me to correspond with the Denver Territorial Office on your behalf? I know what to ask for. He thought about trusting her, which was not actually a difficult thought because he had trusted her with everything for 4 months already without quite noticing when it had started. Yes, he said, please. The correspondence with Denver took 6 weeks. During those 6 weeks, Werner Hogue made 2 more visits and left 2 more letters, each incrementally more threatening than the last, and Cole rode past the ranch's south fence line twice on routes that served no practical purpose and were clearly intended as display. Cyrus was not particularly intimidated by display, but he watched it and noted it and told Dutch to make sure the east fence gate was locked at night. In the middle of the correspondence trouble, something happened that had nothing to do with Garrett Cole, and everything to do with the larger truth of what was developing on the Yates ranch. It was a Sunday in late July, hot with the particular dry heat of the Colorado high desert in summer, and Cyrus was out on the northern pasture checking on a section of fence that Pete had reported as weak. And when he came back over the ridge above the house, he saw Eva sitting on the bank of the creek where it ran through the north corner of the house pasture, with her shoes off and her feet in the water. Reading a book with the specific absorbed contentment of a person who has found exactly the right place to be. He should have ridden on down to the barn and left her to it. He knew that. He also knew, with the certainty of a man who has been honest with himself long enough to recognize when he is being dishonest, that he was not going to. He tied his horse to a fence post and came down the bank and sat beside her, not quite close enough to be presumptuous, and she looked up from her book without surprise, as though she had heard him coming and simply waited. "Fence is holding," he said, for something to say. "Good," she said, and closed her book, which was an invitation whether she intended it as one or not. The creek made its sound. The cottonwoods moved overhead. The mountains were very blue against the white of the July sky. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Yes," she said, without the hesitation that the question sometimes produced. "When you came here," he said, choosing his words with a care that he was aware was transparently careful, "what were you looking for exactly? The real answer." She was quiet for a moment. A meadowlark sang somewhere in the grass upstream. "I was looking for a place that was real," she said. "I told you that first evening. I know. I'm asking what real meant to you." She turned and looked at him, and he met her gaze, and the quality of that eye contact was different from anything that had come before it. It was more direct, more exposed. The careful professional distance of the previous 4 months was present but thinner now, transparent in a way that both of them could see through. "A place where things grow from what you actually put into them," she said slowly. "Where there's a genuine connection between the work and the result, between the intention and the outcome." She looked back at the water. "Daniel and I talked often about finding such a place. We never did before he died. I thought perhaps I could find it for myself, even if it wasn't what we had imagined." A pause. "I found it here." Cyrus looked at his hands for a moment, the calloused working hands of a man who has built things for a long time, and he said, because it was true and because Dutch had told him to tell her and because he was running out of ways to say it that were not quite saying it, "I built all of this without knowing why. 7 years, and I never had a clear answer for what it was for. Not the land, not the house. I thought maybe I just needed to build something real. Maybe that was enough of a reason." He paused. "I think I understand it better now," he said. The silence after that sentence was very full. She turned and looked at him, and what was in her face was not the careful professional expression or the polite social expression or even the specific warm expression she sometimes wore when Pete did something endearing. It was something much more unguarded, something that Cyrus recognized with a deep internal vibration as matching something in his own face that he could not control. "Cyrus," she said, and it was the first time she had used his first name in exactly that way, with exactly that weight, without the social framing of practical conversation around it. "Eva," he said, and the name in his mouth felt like something he had been carrying a long time and had finally set down. They sat on the bank of the creek in the cottonwood shade for a long time after that, talking and not talking in the fluid alternation of people who have found a rhythm together. And when they finally walked back up to the house, they walked close enough that their hands occasionally brushed, and neither of them moved away. He did not kiss her that day. He was not that kind of man. He was the kind of man who, having recognized something important, wanted to do it properly. But something had shifted between them as openly and irreversibly as a gate swinging wide, and both of them knew it. That evening at dinner, Pete looked from one of them to the other and back again, with the expression of a man who is desperately trying not to say anything, which was visibly causing him physical difficulty. Dutch ate his food and said nothing and looked privately satisfied. The response from Denver came on the 14th of August, and it was clear and categorical in Eva's favor. The 1880 rights assignment did supersede the 1877 territorial survey designation for private parcels, and the Durango Land Office wrote a follow-up confirmation within the week. Werner Hogue, faced with the official documentation, withdrew the challenge with minimal grace, and Garrett Cole's riders stopped appearing on the south fence line. Cole himself did not entirely retreat. He was not that kind of man, but the direct legal avenue had closed, and without it he had less leverage, and Cyrus was watchful enough and established enough in the area that a more aggressive approach would have consequences Cole was not yet willing to accept. The matter settled, and the summer moved toward its end, and everything on the ranch was good and working well, and the particular sweetness of the situation between Cyrus and Eva deepened in the slow, careful way that things deepen when both people involved are taking it seriously. He asked her to ride with him one Saturday morning to the South Meadow, where he was planning to expand the hay operation, ostensibly to look at the ground, actually to be in her company without the practical business of the ranch as the official reason. She came without requiring the official reason to be more convincing, which told him something. They rode in the easy side-by-side way they had developed over the summer, and when he stopped at the edge of the meadow to look at the grass, she stopped beside him and they sat their horses in the August warmth and looked at the wide open land together. "I've been thinking," he said, watching the grass and not her face, which was where he had to start with the steadier view. "About the hay operation," she said, and he could hear something in her voice that knew he was not talking about the hay operation. "About you," he said. "About what I want to say to you and how to say it without it being clumsy." A pause. "How are you doing so far?" He looked at her then. She was watching him with those dark, steady eyes, and there was a warmth in them that had been growing for weeks and was now fully present, no longer hidden behind the professional distance or the careful social framing. "Clumsy," he admitted. She smiled. A real one, a wide one, the kind that reached her eyes and changed everything about her face. He had seen it rarely enough that it still had the power to stop him. "Then just say it," she said. He took a breath. The mountains were close and clear in the August air. The meadow grass moved in the slight wind. His horse shifted and was still. "I don't know when it happened," he said, "or maybe I do. Maybe it happened in Bauer's store the morning I saw you tell Arthur Mott that you weren't distressed. You were being cheated, which were two different conditions. I think it started there." He paused. "But that's not the point. The point is that everything I've built out here, all 7 years of it, it's made more sense to me in the 4 months you've been here than in the 6 years before it. And what I want to say to you, in as straightforward a way as I can manage, is that I would like you to consider staying not because I am your employer, but because I am a man who would like very much to be more than that to you, if you would permit it." He stopped talking and waited, which was the hardest part, the particular nerve-exposing vulnerability of having said a true thing and needing to hear what comes back. She was quiet for a moment, and the moment stretched, and then she said, "I stopped thinking of you as my employer sometime in June." He looked at her. "I am a practical woman," she said. "I have been a practical woman since I was 20, and I have been one necessarily since I was 24. I do not romanticize things. But I have been sitting in that chair in the parlor every evening for 6 weeks, leaving the other chair empty, and I would be lying to both of us if I pretended I didn't know why." She looked at him steadily with the full directness that was one of the things about her that consistently took his breath. "I would like to permit it, Cyrus, very much." He let out a breath that he had not known he was holding, and the meadow grass moved and the horses stood patiently in the warm air. "Then I would like to begin," he said. "We already have," she said. "You just didn't ask until now." He laughed. He laughed in a way he had not laughed in years, something fully open and genuine, the laughter of a man who has been let out of a confinement he had gotten so used to he had stopped noticing the walls. He reached across the space between their horses, and she put her hand in his, and they sat like that in the August meadow with the mountains all around them, and it was the simplest and most complete moment he had ever occupied. The weeks that followed had the particular quality of a season both fully present and moving too fast, the way summer always does when you are finally paying attention to it. They rode together most mornings, and they sat together most evenings, and the evenings grew longer and more layered as the ease between them deepened. They talked about everything, about the land and its history, about what she wanted for the future and what he was hoping for, about small things and large things, about the specific creak of the house in the wind and the behavior of the bay mare and the best approach to the coyote problem in the north pasture, and 100 other things that mattered because they were the warp and weft of a shared life beginning to take shape. He learned her fully. He learned that she woke early, earlier than anyone else on the property, and that she spent the first 30 minutes of every morning sitting on the back step with coffee watching the mountains in the pre-dawn transition, and that this was not something she invited company for, and he respected that. He learned that she was quietly fierce about injustice, in the way that people are fierce about things they have experienced personally, and that she was specifically and carefully attentive to the situation of the Ute people on the surrounding land, who had been pushed progressively onto a reservation through a series of agreements in the late 1870s and early 1880s that she described, accurately, as catastrophic and unjust. He agreed with her. The land he was ranching had been Ute land before the territorial arrangements had reduced what remained to them, and he held that knowledge with a seriousness that Eva recognized and respected. He learned that she was not sentimentally afraid of hard truths, but that she held genuine tenderness toward things that were vulnerable, animals and children, and people whose situations left them exposed. He had watched her spend an entire cold October afternoon with a calf that had gotten separated from its mother, patient and steady in the way that some people are patient with things that are frightened, and he had understood something about her in that afternoon that he could not quite translate into words but that he carried forward. She learned him too. He could tell because she stopped explaining things she knew he already understood and started asking him questions that went past the surface of things. She asked him once in the middle of October, sitting by the fire in the evening after Pete and Dutch had said good night, why he had come west specifically, why Colorado, why this particular piece of ground. He thought about it honestly. "My father was a man who built things in Missouri," he said. "Good things, solid things. And then the war came and people took those things or burned them or just stopped caring about them in the way that people stop caring about solid things when everything is burning. And he never rebuilt. He just contracted, got smaller, died small." He paused. "I didn't want to die small." She looked at him across the fire. "You built very large," she said. "I built very alone," he said, "which I thought was the same thing. It isn't." She reached across and put her hand on his, which she had started doing in the evenings with a naturalness that still every time registered somewhere in him as extraordinary. "No," she said quietly. "It isn't." He looked at their hands. Her hand was smaller than his and had its own set of calluses, because she was a woman who worked. He had noticed this and loved it, the realness of it, the honest evidence of a life actually lived. Said, "I would like to ask you something." "Then ask," she said, and her voice was very soft in the firelight. "I would like to ask you to marry me," he said. "Not because it's the practical arrangement, and not because the winter is coming, and not because of what anyone else might think about the situation. I would like to ask you because I have been looking at you for 6 months, and every day I am more certain that you are the person I have been figuring out how to live alongside for my entire adult life. I would like you to be my wife, Eva, if you'll have me." The fire snapped. Outside, the wind had picked up, the first real edge of autumn in it, and it moved around the corners of the house with the sound that had once been lonely and now, with her in it, was just the sound of the house doing what a house does. She looked at him for a long, rich moment, and her eyes were bright in the firelight, and she said, "Cyrus Yates." "Yes." He kissed her then, because it was the time and the place, and because he had been careful long enough. It was not a tentative kiss. It was the kiss of two people who have both waited a long time and mean what they are doing, slow and warm and complete. And when it was done, he rested his forehead against hers, and they sat in the firelight with the October wind going around the house and the whole ranch settling into the night around them. "I should tell Pete," she said. He laughed again, and that laughter was its own kind of warmth. "He already knows," Cyrus said. "He's known since June." "Dutch?" she asked. "Dutch knew before we did," Cyrus said. She pulled back slightly to look at him, and her expression was the most open and unguarded he had ever seen it, happiness without any of the reservation she usually kept between herself and the world. "I'm glad you built it," she said. He looked at her. "What?" "The ranch," she said. "All of it. I'm glad you built it." Something settled in him then that had been unsettled for 7 years, as fully and finally as a thing can settle. The particular interior peace of a man who has built without knowing why and suddenly and completely understands the answer. "So am I," he said. "God, so am I." They were married in November, at the Methodist Church in Harlow, in a small ceremony attended by Pete and Dutch and Henrik Bauer from the general store and his wife, and 4 of the neighboring families who had become friendly with the ranch over the years. The Reverend Charles Marsh performed the service with a warmth that suggested he found it genuinely rather than professionally moving, which Eva appreciated and Cyrus noticed. Eva wore a deep green dress that she and Margaret Folsom, wife of the neighboring rancher, had spent 3 Sundays working on together, because Margaret Folsom was a woman of genuine goodwill who had taken to Eva early and expressed that goodwill in practical ways. She had her hair pinned up with a few dark red pieces loose around her face, and she stood in the church doorway for a moment before the service with the autumn light behind her. And Cyrus, waiting at the front of the church, turned when the door opened and saw her and simply stood still, the way a man stands when the world suddenly and irrevocably rearranges itself around a single image. She walked up the aisle of the small church and took his hand, and her grip was firm and warm, the same grip she had offered him in the back of Bauer's general store the first day they had met, and he held it and they looked at each other and said the words. Pete wept. He wept with the uninhibited openness of a genuinely emotional young man, and later claimed it was dust in his eyes, which no one believed for a moment. Dutch shook Cyrus's hand after the ceremony with more strength than a man his age should have had and said 3 words. "About time, son." Then he went to get food. They spent their first night as a married couple in the ranch house, which felt different in the way that the same place can feel different when what it contains has changed fundamentally, when the intangible weight of something has finally and properly settled into its place. Cyrus had put a fire in the bedroom and left a lamp burning on the dresser that Eva had brought from St. Louis, one of the few things that had traveled with her across the whole journey west, a small brass lamp with a painted glass shade in deep blue, and it threw blue and gold light across the room. Eva stood at the window looking out at the dark ranch yard, and the mountain silhouettes above the tree line, and he came and stood behind her, close but not touching, and she leaned back against him with the naturalness of a woman who has finally come to the place she was always meant to be. "I used to look at places like this from the outside," she said quietly. "Solid houses, good fences, the kind of place that looks like something permanent was built there. And I thought about what it must feel like to be inside instead of outside." He put his arms around her, both of them looking out at the ranch in the November dark. "How does it feel?" he said. She turned her head slightly, and he could see the side of her face and the small, real, unbounded smile. "Like everything I was trying to find when I didn't know what I was looking for," she said. He held her and they stood in the blue lamplight of the first night of the rest of it, and outside the ranch was quiet and solid and whole. Winter came down hard that year, as it often did in the San Juan foothills, with early snow and cold that locked in deep and held until late February. The ranch settled into the long rhythms of winter work, the twice-daily trips to the cattle and the snow pastures, the constant maintenance of the windmill and the water troughs to keep them from freezing, the steady work of the smokehouse and root cellar to make sure the provisions held. It was hard work in the cold, the kind of work that tests whether a place and a partnership are actually sound or only appeared so in the easier seasons. They were sound, utterly, thoroughly sound. Cyrus discovered that Eva in the close quarters of a winter ranch was, if anything, more interesting than Eva in the relative ease of the summer, because she did not withdraw from difficulty or let it diminish her. She got quieter when things were hard, focused in a way that concentrated her energy rather than depleting it, and she brought the same practical intelligence to a frozen water pump at 5 in the morning that she brought to a complicated recipe on a Sunday afternoon. She also brought something else to the winter, which was the particular warmth of a person who actually inhabits a space and fills it with the evidence of a life being actively lived. There were books on the parlor shelf now, and dried flowers from the summer garden in a jar on the kitchen windowsill, and a quilt she was working on in the evening spread across the chair by the fire, and the smell of the house had changed in the specific way that houses change when a woman who cooks with real interest and affection is in them. Garrett Cole, sensing perhaps that the water rights legal avenue was permanently closed, and that Cyrus Yates had become somewhat more formidable now, that he was no longer a solitary man whose attention could be divided, pulled back from direct hostility, and settled into the kind of cold civility that passes for peace in communities where people cannot avoid each other entirely. At the Christmas gathering in Harlow, he shook Cyrus's hand and offered brief congratulations on the marriage in the tone of a man making a strategic retreat. His wife Margaret offered considerably more genuine warmth. Eva thanked both of them with the same unfailing courtesy she extended to everyone, which Garrett Cole could not find purchase in, and which gave Cyrus a private satisfaction he was careful not to show. Pete Aldridge, who had by this point completely abandoned any pretense of maintaining professional distance from the emotional life of his employers, became over the winter months something closer to a younger brother than an employee, a role he occupied with enormous natural ease, and without anyone quite deciding it had been assigned. He ate dinner with them most evenings when the cold was serious, and the bunkhouse was less hospitable than the ranch house kitchen, and he talked about everything under the sun with the comfortable garrulousness of a man who has found his people and intends to stay near them. Dutch continued to be Dutch, which meant he was exactly as helpful and present as he was and no more, saying 3 precise words where other men said 30 imprecise ones, and making himself indispensable in exactly the quiet way that people who know their own worth make themselves indispensable. Spring came back to the San Juan foothills with the particular returning quality of high desert spring, sudden and vivid, and a little startling after the long white silence of winter. The cattle in the south pasture were moving well, and the spring calves were arriving in good numbers, and the kitchen garden beds were thawed and waiting, and the apple trees were budding with a fullness that promised a good year. Eva told Cyrus in March that she was expecting a child. She told him in the morning, on the back step with coffee, in the private time before the working day began, which was where the private things between them were told and held. She turned from the mountains and looked at him with an expression that was trying to read his before committing to its own, the careful, vulnerable look of a person offering something precious enough to be frightened about. He looked at her face, and the expression on his own arranged itself into something he would not have been able to manufacture deliberately, but that happened without effort, the full, open astonishment of a man receiving the best news of his life. "Eva," he said, and his voice was not steady, which was unusual enough that it communicated more clearly than any sentence could have. She let out a breath, and her expression shifted into pure, unguarded joy. "I know," she said. "I know." He put down his coffee cup and took her face in both hands and kissed her forehead, and then her cheek, and then properly, and she laughed against his mouth, that full, real laugh that he had been collecting like rare coins since the day he first heard it. "A child," he said, stepping back to look at her. "In October, I think," she said. He looked out at the ranch, at the garden beds and the barn and the white-painted fence and the mountains above, and everything he had built with his hands over 7 years of not knowing, while looked back at him with a sudden and blazing clarity that knocked the breath out of him in a way that all of the physical labor of 7 years never had. He turned back to Eva, and she was watching him with those dark eyes, reading the change in his face with the precision she brought to everything. "Now you know," she said softly. "I have known since November," he said. "I think I knew before November, but yes." He looked at the ranch again and then back at her. "Now I know." Pete's reaction to the news was immediate and vocal, and involved him dropping an entire armload of fence posts, which Dutch picked up without comment, while Pete enthusiastically explained to no one in particular that this was exactly what he had been saying since last year, and that everything had worked out exactly as it should, and that he intended to teach the child to ride before it could properly walk, which Eva said she would take under advisement. Dutch's reaction was to stop what he was doing, look at Cyrus, and say, "Good man," and then return to work. But Cyrus thought he saw something in the old man's face that might have been the equivalent of tears in a man who no longer possessed a straightforward relationship with that emotion. The summer of 1887 had a different quality from the summer before it. There was more weight in it, more intentionality, a sense of the future becoming specific and present in a way that future tends to become when a child is coming. Eva worked through the pregnancy with the same practical energy she brought to everything, modifying rather than reducing what she did as the months progressed, accepting help when it was genuinely needed and resisting it firmly when it was not. She was magnificent in the specific way that women are magnificent when they are being fully themselves, and Cyrus watched her with an attention that was no longer the carefully managed attention of the preceding months, but the open, full attention of a man who has stopped managing anything. He built a cradle in July, in the evenings after the work was done, from a piece of cherry wood that Pete had found in a timber merchant's offcuts bin in Harlow, and presented with the solemn ceremony of a man making an important contribution. He built it with the same care he had brought to every other thing on the ranch, measuring twice and fitting carefully and sanding, until the surface was smooth enough that a child's skin would find nothing rough to catch on. Eva came into the barn one evening when he was working on it, and stood watching him for a long time without speaking. "You build things with love," she said eventually, which she had said the first day she had arrived, looking at the ranch from the ridge above. He looked up from the work. "You said that the day you came," he said. "I did," she said. "I knew then. I don't think I knew that I knew, but I did." He put down his tools and looked at her. this woman who had arrived in his yard 6 months after he drove the last fence post into the earth. This woman with her steady dark eyes and her capable hands and her full real laugh and her unassailable presence. And he understood with the complete and certain understanding that comes only after years of not understanding that everything he had built had been waiting for exactly this. "Come here," he said. She came and he stood and she leaned into him, her back against his chest, and his hands rested on the curve of her. And outside the barn the summer evening was long and golden, and the mountains were violet in the distance, and the ranch was making all its usual sounds, the cattle and the horses and the creek and the wind, and all of it was full. Their son was born on the 14th of October, 1887, in the ranch house, in the bedroom with the brass lamp casting its blue and gold light, attended by Mrs. Whitmore, the town's midwife, who declared with professional satisfaction that mother and child were in excellent health. Cyrus held the baby, his son, in the first minutes of his life, and the child looked up at him from beneath the miniature serious brows that he would later understand were a direct inheritance, and something in Cyrus's chest expanded to a size he had not known it could reach. Eva, propped against the pillows with the particular exhausted radiance of a woman who has just done the hardest thing and the most important thing simultaneously, watched him hold the baby, and her expression was everything. They named him Thomas Daniel Yates. Thomas for Cyrus's father, who had not died small but had died defeated, and who deserved to have something named after him that was built properly. Daniel for Eva's late husband, who had been a good man, and deserved to be remembered in the continuing life she was making. Thomas Daniel Yates was, from the beginning, both of them in equal measure. He had Eva's dark eyes and Cyrus's quietness, and an additional stubbornness that may have been a synthesis of both. And he was, from his first day in the world, received by everyone on the ranch with a love so comprehensive and unanimous that it was almost absurd. Pete held him on the second day and said, with great feeling, that he was the finest child he had ever seen, which was received kindly given that Pete's experience with infants was limited to theoretical admiration. Dutch held him for exactly 30 seconds on the third day, looked at him with the same deep, assessing look he had turned on Eva the first day she arrived, and said, "He'll do," which was, in Dutch's particular language, a benediction of the highest order. The seasons turned. Thomas grew from infant to sturdy toddler with the particular focused energy of a boy raised on a working ranch, interested in everything and afraid of very little, and following his father through the yard with the dedicated imitation that small children offer to the people they most admire, which Cyrus found alternately heartwarming and alarming because it meant someone was watching everything he did. Eva, released from the immediate demands of new motherhood, returned to the full engagement with the ranch that had characterized her from the beginning, with the addition of Thomas on her hip, or in the sling she had made from good canvas. And the ranch continued to grow and improve under the accumulated attention of two people who were both genuinely and practically capable. Garrett Cole, whose water rights challenge had failed, and whose attempts at social dominance had found no purchase, eventually sold the southern portion of his cattle operation to a Denver investor, and focused his remaining attention on holdings closer to Durango, which suited everyone on the Yates ranch just fine. The threat from that quarter faded into the comfortable neutrality of neighbors who have tested each other and found the boundary between them clearly marked. The community around Harlow grew slowly, as western towns grew in the late 1880s, with new families arriving and settling into the careful pattern of people trying to build something permanent in a country that was still working out what permanence meant. Eva became the person that the newer arrivals sought out, because she was known as someone who was practical and direct and genuinely helpful, who knew the land and the resources and the people, and could tell you with the kind of honest warmth that is rarer than it sounds what you needed to know to settle properly. Cyrus watched her in this role and loved her in this role with a specificity that surprised him every time. The particular recognition that the thing you most love in a person is not what you expected to find, but is exactly what belongs there. They had their second child in 1890, another boy they named James, smaller and louder than Thomas had been, and from his first days obviously equipped with a personality large enough to fill any available space. Thomas regarded his brother with the benign territorial interest of a 3-year-old confronting competition, and then gradually, over the following months, shifted into the protective devotion that would characterize their relationship for the rest of their lives. Pete Aldridge married a young woman named Carrie Folsom, the daughter of the neighboring rancher, in the summer of 1890, and the wedding was held in the yard of the Yates ranch because Eva had offered it and the Folsoms had accepted with gratitude, and the yard was in full summer flower and Cyrus had strung lanterns from the fence rails, and it was, by general agreement, the finest party Harlow County had seen in years. Dutch, who was somewhere past 70 by this point, and had never precisely disclosed his age or his history, but had been a steady and irreplaceable presence on the ranch for 8 years, announced that spring that he thought he might retire to a town somewhere warmer. He said it over breakfast with the same flat directness he said everything, and Eva looked at him across the table for a moment and then said, "Dutch, you are welcome to stay here for the rest of your life, and we would prefer that you did." He looked at her for a long moment with those old, deep eyes, and then he looked at Cyrus, and something passed between them that was male and inarticulate and completely understood, and then he said, "All right," and went back to his coffee. He did not retire. He stayed in the bunkhouse and moved slower than he used to, but remained precisely as useful and precisely as taciturn as he had always been, and the ranch would not have felt properly itself without him. The years layered themselves onto the ranch the way good things build, by accumulation and by care, each season adding to the one before it without erasing anything essential. The apple trees grew old enough to produce properly, heavy with fruit in September that Eva turned into preserves and cider that lasted through the winter. The cattle herd expanded, and Cyrus brought in a good bull from a Colorado Springs breeder that improved the stock measurably over 3 years. Pete, now officially a partner in the enterprise rather than a hired hand, took on the responsibility for the cattle operation with a competence that Cyrus had always known was in him, and which the marriage and the responsibility had called fully forward. Thomas Yates grew into a boy who loved the ranch with his whole body and his whole mind, who was out in the yard before anyone else on most mornings, who learned to ride before he was 5 in the way that Pete had promised, and who had his mother's eyes and his father's hands, and the particular combination of both their best qualities that well-loved children sometimes achieve. James grew into something louder and more expressive, and equally devoted to the ranch in his different way, with a gift for animals that announced itself early in the way. He moved among the horses without fear, and they moved with him without nervousness. And Eva said he reminded her of someone she had known once in Ohio who could do the same thing, and there was a kind of continuity in it that she found beautiful. Eva herself, in the years that followed their marriage, became something that Cyrus spent a great deal of time thinking about in the private hours, not because he needed to analyze it, but because he could not stop being moved by it. She became fully, completely, irrevocably home, in every sense that the word carried. She was home to him when he came in from a long, cold day, and she was in the kitchen. And she was home to him in the particular way she had of turning toward him when he came into a room, not obviously, not with any performance, but with the small involuntary orientation of a person who has aligned themselves with another person so completely that the body knows before the mind. She was home to him in the way she laughed, and in the way she was angry when something deserved anger, and in the way she was tender with the boys and with the animals, and with the people who came to her needing something she had to offer. He told her this one evening in the parlor, in the chairs by the window that had started all of this, Their two chairs that were genuinely theirs now in a way that the empty chairs of the first evening could only anticipate. "Do you know what I am most grateful for?" he said. She looked up from the letter she was writing. "The apple trees," she said. "You've mentioned them several times." "The apple trees are very good," he agreed. "But no." She set down her pen and looked at him with those eyes, still exactly as they had been on the first day, still direct and warm and capable of seeing him completely. "Tell me," she said. "I am most grateful," he said, "that you came looking for the ranch and I was in the store that morning when Mott was trying to cheat you. Because if I had been 10 minutes later, or if you had been 10 minutes later, or if any one of about 40 things had been different, we would have missed each other entirely, and I would have gone on building things for reasons I didn't understand, and you would have found some other position somewhere, and all of this would have been someone else's life." She looked at him for a long, quiet moment. "It wouldn't have been someone else's life," she said. "It would have been the beginning of someone else's story. But this one," she gestured at the room around them, the house with its lamplight and the sounds of boys asleep upstairs and the ranch outside going on with its night life of wind and cattle and the creek running in the dark. "This one was always going to be ours. I'm certain of it." He looked at her. He had been looking at her for 6 years, and it still required, every time, the same full and undivided attention. "How can you be certain of something like that?" he said. "Because you built it," she said simply. "You built all of it without knowing why, for 7 years, and everything about the way you built it was exactly what I needed it to be when I arrived. The kitchen and the garden beds and the spare bedroom and the wide porch and the chairs in the parlor. You built it for someone, Cyrus. You just didn't know who. And I arrived." He had thought about this himself, in the years since November of 1886, in the quiet moments that long marriages make available for reflection. He had thought about the particular mystery of it, of 7 years of building directed by some instinct he had not understood, and a woman arriving who fit into everything he had made with the precision of something that had always belonged there. He did not have a theological or philosophical framework adequate to the thing. He just knew that it was true, in the way that the most essential truths are known, not through argument but through the specific, undeniable evidence of the life that surrounds you. "I built it for you," he said. She reached across the space between their chairs and he took her hand, the familiar, warm, strong grip of the hand he had been holding for 6 years and intended to hold for the rest of his life. "I know," she said, "and I'm here." The autumn of 1892 was the kind of autumn that the San Juan foothills produce occasionally, when everything decides simultaneously to be its most beautiful. The aspen gold blazing against the dark evergreens on the mountain faces, and the sky an impossible blue above all of it, and the air carrying the particular crystalline quality that comes before the first hard frost. Eva told Cyrus in October of that year, standing on the front porch in the morning with their coffee in the way they had taken to standing in the mornings when the weather permitted, that she was expecting again. Their third child arrived in May of 1893, a girl this time, small and dark-haired, and in possession of an expression of great personal conviction from her earliest days. They named her Louisa Margaret Yates, Margaret for the midwife who had been at all 3 births and who declared Louisa to be her finest achievement, which was a professional judgment that everyone accepted graciously. Thomas, aged 5, regarded his sister with an expression of concentrated devotion that was both immediate and apparently permanent. James, aged 3, poked her once experimentally, was quietly but firmly redirected by his mother, and then settled into a watchful protective posture that was almost identical to his brother's. Cyrus held Louisa in the lamplight of the bedroom where all of this had started, and she looked up at him with Eva's eyes in miniature, those dark, direct eyes that could see everything. And he thought about the empty ranch on the morning after the last fence post, the hollow quality of it, the silence that had pressed against him like something physical. Then he looked at Eva, tired and radiant in the familiar way, watching him hold their daughter with that full, open expression that she had never once moderated or withheld in all the years of their marriage. "3," he said. "3," she agreed with a smile. "The parlor is going to be crowded," he said. "We'll need more chairs," she said. He laughed. He laughed with the easy, full naturalness that had been his since November of 1886, the laughter of a man who is genuinely, thoroughly, without qualification alive. "I'll build them," he said. The ranch went on. The seasons came and went in their cycles, and the children grew, and Pete and Carrie Aldridge had children of their own who ran in the yard, alongside Thomas and James and Louisa on the summer days. And the apple trees produced their annual abundance, and the cattle herd was strong, and the hay fields were good, and the San Juan Mountains stood above everything exactly as they had always stood, patient and vast, and indifferent to the small and enormous human dramas playing out at their feet. Cyrus Yates had built the ranch for 7 years without knowing why. Eva Hawkins had come west looking for something real without knowing what she would find. They had found each other in the back of a general store in a small railroad town on a Thursday morning in the spring of 1886, and they had built the rest of it together, with the accumulated weight of years and seasons and children, and the daily work of a shared life. On a morning in the October of 1895, 9 years after Eva had first ridden in from the ridge above the ranch and said that someone had put a great deal of love into this place, Cyrus stood on the front porch in the gray pre-dawn, as he had stood once before, but this time with a cup of coffee that was hot and a dog at his feet, and the sounds of the house coming awake behind him. He could hear Eva in the kitchen, the particular sounds of her early morning that he had memorized without trying to, the scrape of the iron range, and the sound of the pump, and the low half-voiced melody she sang when she thought no one was listening. He could hear Thomas, 10 years old and already serious and capable, and devoted to the ranch in the full-bodied way of a boy who was going to spend his life here, moving in the barn doing the early morning feeding. He could hear James, 8 and still loud and still the most enthusiastic person on the property, somewhere upstairs probably in the middle of an argument with the morning. He could hear Louisa, 2 years old, making the particular sounds of a 2-year-old who has decided it is time to be awake and active, and is communicating this opinion clearly to anyone in range. He looked out at the ranch in the October pre-dawn, at the fences he had built, and the barn he had raised, and the kitchen garden that Eva had expanded twice, and the apple trees heavy with the last of their fruit, at the white house with its lamplight in the windows and the wide porch where he and Eva had spent 100 evenings, and where they would spend 100 more. He thought about the man he had been in 1879 in Missouri, with his father's horse and his dead father's money, and that enormous, poorly understood conviction that if he built something real, something would fill in the empty place at the center of his chest. He had built it. It had taken 7 years. And on a Thursday morning in May of 1886, Eva Hawkins had ridden in from the ridge above with her traveling hat and her carpet bag and her direct dark eyes and her complete refusal to be anyone other than exactly who she was. And everything had filled in, completely, finally, with the specific and irreplaceable weight of her. The kitchen door opened and Eva came out onto the porch with her own coffee, her hair down over her shoulder because it was early and she had not yet pinned it up, wearing the warm wool wrapper she wore in the cold months, and she stood beside him and looked out at the ranch in the morning gray, and he put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and they looked at what they had built together, what he had started alone and she had completed by arriving. "Good morning," she said. "Very good," he said. She turned and looked at him with those eyes that could always see him completely, and she smiled, the full real smile that was still, after 9 years, one of the things he was most grateful for in the world. He leaned down and kissed her temple, and the dogs shifted at their feet, and from the barn came the sound of Thomas singing something to the horses, and from inside the house came the increasingly determined sounds of Louisa pursuing her morning agenda, and from somewhere upstairs James made a sound indicating that the morning was losing the argument with him, and the mountains above the ranch line were beginning to catch the first light, turning from black to deep blue to the particular rose and gold of the high country dawn. Cyrus Yates held his wife on the front porch of the ranch he had built for 7 years without knowing who it was for, and he looked at everything that was his life, and the empty place that had existed in the center of his chest since he was young enough to notice it was full, completely full, in every direction, with everything that mattered. He had built it with his hands. She had made it a home. Between the two of them, they had made it a life.